It's day 2 of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers, and today we get a look at the biggest, baddest blood artist of all time, some sneaky skeleton support, and a bunch more sweet cards, so let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So today, we thankfully don't have quite as many cards as yesterday. My goodness, was that a lot of spoiler cards, but we have some really sweet, super exciting stuff that I think is going to have an impact on Standard, maybe some older formats, and definitely in Commander, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Murders at Karlov Manor cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, to keep up on the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Second, if you need some of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Anyway, let's talk some Murders at Karlov Manor. We kick things off today with a new black mythic vampire assassin in Ripper of Bloodlines, and I think this card might actually be pretty good. So 6 mana, 6/5, flying vampire assassin. It has Ward of Sacrifice a creature, and then whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So of course, if your opponent wants to kill this and they do manage to pay the ward, that's going to trigger Ripper of the Bloodlines. So worst case, if your opponent wants to kill this with targeted removal, they're going to go down a creature and they're going to lose 2 life and you're going to gain 2 life. So even that by itself is really strong. And this ward is the main reason I'm excited about this card. This is one of the strongest wards we've ever seen. The only card that really compares to it is Sauron the Dark Lord. If you've ever played Commander and tried to kill a Sauron, you know how hard it is to have to pay the ward of sack a legendary artifact or creature. It's not literally hexproof, but it's a very, very strong form of protection. Ripper of Bloodlines, actually pretty close to Sauron as far as what this does on the battlefield. I think Sauron's ward is a little bit stronger since you got to sack specifically a legendary creature, but it's 2024. I think yesterday there were, 25 rare and mythic creatures spoiled and like 17 were legendary. So everything's a legend anyway. So all this to say, Ripper of Bloodlines, pretty close to being Sauron, and it's not even legendary, so you can stack up multiples in the battlefield if you're playing Standard. So I think this card might be pretty reasonable. If you look at Standard, this gets through entangles with pretty much every flyer in the format, outside of, I guess, Archfiend of the Dross it would trade with, and then Atrox the Grand Unifier, of course, is bigger than everything. But in general, if your opponent's playing Lost Caverns of Ixalan Gods, random bats, and so forth, this is just going to dominate the air, and then once it's on the battlefield, it's essentially a double blood artist. Every creature that dies, your creatures or your opponent's is going to drain for 2. That means if you're some sort of sacrifice deck, you need a total of, 10 creatures to win the game on the spot by just sacrificing your board. And even if you don't win on the spot, it's still a huge boost of life gain, a lot of life loss for your opponent. So I think this card could maybe show up in sack decks. I'm honestly most skeptical of it showing up in scap decks, at least the ones we have currently, just because 6 mana is so much for like an Oni Called Anvil deck, maybe some sort of Bart sacrifice deck. Those decks tend to be pretty low to the ground, so I'm not sure they really want a 6-drop, but if they do, this is an absurd finisher for those decks. The good news is, you don't really have to be a sack deck to play this. I think this card is strong enough, and its ward is good enough, that you can just play this in kind of any black deck that can get up to 6 mana. If you're super aggro, it's going to be too much mana, but mid-range style decks, think of like Rakdos midrange, you're sacking Blood Tithe Harvesters, things are dying to removal spells. This seems like a solid finisher there. Maybe some sort of Esper mid-range control deck, even just the mono black Sheoldra decks. A couple of copy of these on the top end are probably going to be good enough. And then once you get back to Commander, I think there's really 3 homes for this card. So in Commander, I think the best home actually is sack decks. If you're playing like Korvald or Jury, getting up to 6 mana isn't really a thing in Commander, easy enough to do, and then this comes down, it's going to be hard to kill, and you can probably just drain someone out of the game by sacking your board. The other places I think this shows up in Commander is decks that care about its creature type. So it's a vampire assassin, so I think this is probably good enough for any vampire deck. So if you're playing your $150 or whatever it is, Edgar Markov's, probably good enough to just run this for value. Gonna be even better in vampire sack decks. We just kind of got this theme in Lost Caverns of Ixalan with like Krolavino. So if you're playing a vampire sack deck, this gets even better. And then it also seems good in assassins. There's only so many good assassins in Magic, so I think Atronidax Ramses probably run this as well, just because it's a really strong assassin. So Ripper of Bloodlines, I think this card is actually pretty legit. That ward is really scary. It's going to make it hard to get off the battlefield, even though it doesn't have an ETB trigger. Thanks to that ward cost, worst case your opponent kills this with targeted removal right away, they still go down a creature, and they have to lose 2 life and you gain 2 life. So you're still going to get value out of this. I guess the worst case is your opponent just like farewells or sunfalls, and that would be sad. But as far as dealing with this with targeted removal, there's really no way to do it properly, which I think makes this a pretty strong card. We also got a new case, in Case of the Stashed Skeleton. So 2-mana black case, when it enters a battlefield, you create a 2/1 black skeleton creature token and suspect it. So it's going to have menace, but it's not going to be able to block. And then to solve it, you have to control no suspected skeletons. So essentially, assuming you're not playing a skeleton deck, which you probably aren't, once the token goes away, you sacrifice it, it dies in combat, then you get to solve the case. And once you solve the case, you can pay 2 sack it, search your library for a card, put it in your hand, and then shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. So essentially your reward is a demonic tutor sitting out on the battlefield. So the question is, how good is this card actually? And I think the answer is it might be pretty strong. So obviously, if you are a skeleton deck, I think this card is pretty good. Yeah, it might be a little harder to get to the tutor because maybe your other skeletons become suspect somehow, but discounting that, there's not that many good skeletons, so if you're trying to go off with Corpse of the Lost or Skeletal Swarming or whatever, this is probably going to make your deck just because it's an on-curve skeleton creature. I think in Standard, it's going to be really interesting to see if this is good enough to play as a generic card. If you think of the popular Black X2 drops, you got Tenacious Underdog, you got Deep Cavern Bat, you got Blood Tithe Harvest, you got Mosswood Dreadnought, you got Razorlash Transmograte. These are all cards that show up in Mono Black and Rakdos and Golgari, some of the most popular decks in the format. Where does Case of the Stashed Skeleton compare to these cards? So the downside is, you're getting a worse creature, right? You're getting a 2/1 Menace Can't Block creature, which is worse than pretty much all these other creatures. Its stats aren't as big, it doesn't have evasion, it can't play any defense, so that's a drawback. The upside is, eventually, it's going to turn into a demonic tutor, which none of these other things can do. I think it's really going to depend on your deck, right? Like, if you're playing just some generic aggro deck that's topping out at 3 mana with Gix or something, I don't know if this is really that exciting. What are you going to tutor up in that deck? But if you're some sort of black deck that's getting to like Cruelty of Gix, has powerful 1/ofs to close off the game, then I think this goes up in value. The other place I really like this card is in Sacrifice style decks. We're actually just talking about these because they're a ripper of Bloodlines. One of the issues with the skeleton is it's only a 2/1 and it can't block, and it also has menace, which means what's probably going to happen is you're going to play it and it's just going to attack your opponent for a few turns, and chipping in for 2 is nice, but it's not really game ending, and you can't really use the tutor mode and solve the case until you get rid of that skeleton or make something else a suspect, I guess, if being a suspect deck is a thing. And you can't really solve the case until you get rid of the skeleton, which might be kind of tricky, like or take some time at least. But if you're playing a sack deck with Tyrion's Journal or Bart, maybe you're playing Vrons and Ripper Bloodlines, then this becomes pretty insane, right? You get a 2/1, it can't block, sure, whatever, it's still sack fodder. Sacrificing the skeleton will solve the case, and then you can tutor up whatever your payoff is, your one of Ripper Bloodlines or something, to combo off and win the game on the spot. Once you get back to Commander, Skeleton Ship finally getting some support. Skeleton Tribal is like one of the least supported, jankiest tribes in all of Commander, so I don't think it actually changes anything there, but it does seem pretty good in sack decks, again, if you can just easily get rid of that skeleton, because in Commander, the problem kind of becomes even worse. With everyone at 40 life, you can take a lot of hits off that skeleton, so you really need a way to kill it or hope it gets wrathed away, but if you can sacrifice it to Corvald or Jury or Braids, then this is going to be a really good card. This is another tutor that also gives you some sack fodder, and then lets you find whatever you need in a given situation. So Case of the Stashed Skeleton, really like this card for sack decks in specific, and there might be some chance that it can show up in just like mono black aggro style drops for value. We also got Pyrotechnic Performer, which is a card that I think might actually be really strong. So a 2-mana 3/2 red Vishinu Assassin, it has Disguise, so you can play it face down, is a mega morph 3-mana 2/2 with ward 2, and then flip it up for just a single mana, and it says when it or another creature you control is turned face up, that creature deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So when I first read this card, I was like, okay, this seems pretty good in some sort of disguise deck. Maybe you're like trying to get some massive creature face down with a Trotta and then flipping it up with Expose the Culprits and just getting them, and it probably would be good there. If there is a disguise deck, especially an aggro disguise deck, this card is probably a part of it. But the more I thought about Pyrotechnic Performer, the more I became convinced that this might just be a really good mono red aggro card by itself. If you look at mono red aggro, kind of the big hitters in the 2-drop slot: Bloodthirsty Adversary, Charming Scoundrel, Felden, Inti to a lesser extent, but I think the most stapley ones are really Bloodthirsty Adversary and then Charming Scoundrel. Think about Bloodthirsty Adversary. What is the value of this card? The value is, it's a 2-mana 2/2 on turn 2, and it does have haste, which is a big upside, and then later in the game, it's like a 5-mana 3/3 that also has a lightning strike attached to it or something, thanks to its ability to flashback something from the graveyard. Pyrotechnic Performer, in a weird way, is kind of similar. So you can run this out as a 2-mana 3/2 on turn 2, and that's a perfectly fine above the curve aggro threat, but it's also very flexible. If you get to turn 4, you can play this face down as a 2/2 with ward 2, and then you can flip it up for 1 mana, so 4 total mana. You end up getting a 3/2, and also essentially getting a lava spike at your opponent's face, which is a lot of value. So this is a 2-drop that in the early game, it's fine just to run it out, and then in the late game, it's kind of a burn spell when you have the extra mana. It reminds me of like Vashino Pyromancer all grown up. So I think this might actually be just good enough for mono red in standard. The other thing that's cute about it is they do stack up. If you're playing 4 of these, the first one is dealing 3 damage when it flips up, but the second one is going to deal 6 damage because both Pyrotechnic Performers are going to take and trigger when a creature is flipped face up, and we'll have to wait and see. So far we haven't seen many other aggro disguise creatures, but if we get more cheap red like disguise morph stuff, this could go way up in value because this triggers off any creature flipping face up. The other thing I want to mention about this card is it's kind of cute with pump spells, which are already seen play in some mono red decks. So let's say you get this disguised, you flip it up for 1 mana. It says when it or another creature is turned face up, the creature deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So how this works is you flip it up, Pyrotechnic Performer is going to put a trigger on the stack that says deal damage equal to my power. With that trigger on the stack, if you start slinging some monstrous rages and ancestral hangers to grow its power, you can deal a ton of damage with that flip it up trigger, maybe enough to kill your opponent, especially if you can like haste in the Pyrotechnic Performer, or if you've had it on the battlefield for a turn. When you flip it up, it's going to have pseudo haste because it's not a new creature. It already lost summoning sickness. So you flip it up, cast a bunch of pump spells, dome your opponent for like 10, attack for another 10, close out the game, which is really scary. So Pyrotechnic Performer, one of the best aggro cards I think we've seen from the set so far, and a card that I think is going to see competitive play in standard. We also got Steamcore Scholar. This one, I'm not sure about. So 3-mana 2/2. It's a weird detective with flying and vigilance. When it ETBs, you draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, unless you discard an instant or sorcery card or a creature card with flying. So Steamcore Scholar, remember the days when Windrake was like top pick and limited, just a 3-mana 2/2 flyer? How far we have come. This is like the best Windrake of all time. It isn't rare, but this is a Windrake that like double loots, maybe generates card advantage depending on what you discard. It has vigilance. It's a really strong 3-mana flyer. It reminds me a little bit of Champion of the Wits, I think is the closest comparison. It's essentially Champion of Wits that loses Eternalize but gains flying and vigilance and an extra point of toughness. And Champion of Wits actually saw a lot of playback in its day in standard because it's a really nice way of filling the graveyard. Other comparisons that might be more of a stretch, but like Seasoned Pyromancer, Fable the Mirror Breaker, they have this like same double looting type effect. And Steamcore Scholar actually has a better looting effect because you get to draw first and then discard, similar to Champion of Wits. And many of these cards have seen play specifically in decks that are looking to stock the graveyard. And I think that's the purpose of Steamcore Scholar. Maybe you're trying to reanimate Atraxa. This is just an okay body that gets to the Atraxa in the graveyard, digs for your Cruelty of Gix, sets up your big combo turn. Maybe you're trying to fill the graveyard with evidence, so you can collect evidence with Analyze Apollon or Azoni. This is a way you just get things with high mana values into your graveyard that you're able to collect evidence and trigger your other things. Maybe you're trying to set up the Melic Fling combo kill we talked about yesterday. This is just a way that you can discard some instants and sorceries, get them in the graveyard to grow your Melic and set up the Fling combo kill. The only downside I see is its ETB draw mode is not a May, and Shieldred is still the most played creature in Standard. So there are going to be times when, like, your opponent has the Shieldred, and you really need to answer, and you top deck this, and you're like, oh my god, am I going to cast this and, like, take 4 Shieldred damage to try to dig for an answer? So it is a little weak against Shieldred, but I still think in decks where filling your graveyard is important, where finding your combo pieces to be able to get something back from the graveyard, set up some graveyard combo kill, Steamcore Scholar should have a role there, similar to Champion of Wits when it was in Standard. Next up, we got a mythic that I kind of missed yesterday, but I think is important enough for a couple of reasons to talk about, and that is Voja, Jaws of the Conclave. So Voja is one of those 3 cards that are pre-release promos, alongside Melik and Tomic, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. When we mentioned there's some awkwardness that you get these in your pre-release packs, but you can't actually play them at your pre-release. They're not legal to play, which is a little bit weird, especially for new players. The other reason I wanted to mention this, really there's 2, but one of the big ones is I'm a little concerned about how these cards are being released. So we didn't get into this yesterday because I didn't actually realize this, but as far as I can see, the only place these cards exist are in pre-release packs. And if you remember, it wasn't that long ago that we had some pretty big issues with exclusive buy a box promos like Nexus of Fate, like breaking out, being really good, ending up super expensive because they weren't actually a normal booster pack, so you couldn't just crack a pack and get more of them. And I feel like that's happening again. Or if you're an old timer, maybe Nalathani Dragon and the Dragon Con incident from 1994, but we've seen in the past issues where exclusive cards are released in this time-limited, very small manner, and if those cards end up being good or popular, then they get really expensive, and it's not easy to reprint quickly, because it's not like there's just a whole bunch of them sitting around in booster packs for people to open and get more of. So I'm a little bit worried about us going back to exclusive promo cards, and doubly so that you can't even play them at pre-release. What's the upside? Just give them to people as door prizes or something if you want to do it that way. The other reason we got to talk about this card is I think Voja is actually like a super scary legit commander card. So Voja, Jaws of the Conclave, 5 mana 5/5 Naya Legendary Wolf. It has Vigilance, Trample, and Ward 3. It says when it attacks, put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is the number of elves you control, and then draw a card for each wolf you control. So could this card see play in Standard? It is Standard legal, just not pre-release legal. And the answer is for fun. Like, the big problem is, for this card to really be good, you need probably a bunch of elves or maybe a bunch of wolves on the battlefield. While in our 3-year Standard format, there are enough elves in existence to build an elf deck. Gala Greeters, Leaf Crown Visionaries, Fauna Shamans. Green is a pretty weak color in Standard. I wouldn't expect Naya elves with Voja to be really good. Wolves are even in worse shape. Remember in Magic, wolves and werewolves, not the same creature type. So this cares about literal wolves, not werewolves. So there's a few Cemetery Prowler, Primal Adversary, Ascendant Pack Leader, but really not a ton. So I don't really think this is a Standard card, although if you want to take the Voja Standard challenge, I would play it with haste. I think that's the most powerful thing to do with this card, because the payoff here is really its attack trigger. If you can play a bunch of elves, drop this attack with it, your elves are going to get massive, probably just kill your opponent on the spot. There are ways to do this in Standard. Rabbit Battery, Bitter Reunion, Reckless Stormseeker. Unfortunately, none of them are like elf cards or wolf cards, but still, I guess you can play a Rabbit Battery in your elf Voja deck. The place this is really going to shine, though, isn't in Standard, it's in Commander. In Commander, I think this is going to legitimately be one of the most popular new commanders from the set. So in Commander, giving this haste isn't a problem. You're probably already playing Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots. And in Commander, elves are super popular. Like, literally one of the most popular tribes in the entire format. Lathrill's like the #2 commander on EDH Rec or something. Players love playing with elves. And one of the problems with elves is they don't really have a Naya commander. Right now, if you look at the most popular Naya elves commanders, there are cards like Rocco and Oben, which aren't really elf commanders. They just happen to be elves, so people play them because there's no better options. Oben's like the funniest example because it's really like an elemental landfall commander, which is very not elfy at all, but it just happens to be an elf. Voja, I think, immediately becomes the go-to Naya elf commander, and it's not just a Naya elf commander, it's a really strong one. If you think about it, going into into white and red with your elves actually gives you a lot of cool cards. You get a bunch of Radas and Bloodbraid Elves and Wintleaf Leaves and Arwins and Aragods, and Voja does exactly what an elf deck wants. If you think about elves, they just flood the board super quickly with all these dorky mana dorks, and then all of a sudden Voja comes down, makes them huge, and kills your opponent on the spot. It's almost like having this weird mini crater hoof in your command zone, just hanging out and waiting for you to get enough elves on the battlefield that this comes down, you haste it up, and just kill everyone. So I think this is actually going to be not only a legit powerful commander, but a very popular commander as a Naya Elf commander. So Voja, I mean, I guess if you want it, go to your pre-release and hope you open one. I wish it was showing up in actual booster packs, but discounting that, this card is really, really scary, and I think it's going to be very popular in Commander because players just love their elves. We also got a sweet new white enchantment in Assemble the Player. So if you remember the teaser for Murders at Karlov Manor, Mark Rosewater mentioned something about a white card that let you play off the top of your library. Well, this is the card. It's a 2-mana enchantment that says you can look at the top card of your library at any time, and once each turn, you may cast a creature spell with power 2 or less from the top of your library. So this is essentially another twist on Future Sight. Future Sight's like the OG of this effect, and we've seen in just the last few years, Wizards really embrace this design. We have so many cards now that let you play this or that off the top of your deck, but it's relatively new in white. This is like the white weenie version of Future Sight. So this is a card that I think is incredibly powerful, but you need to be a pretty specific deck to make it work. I think an easy but weird comparison is Collected Company. Collected Company is an incredibly strong card. It sees play all the way back to Modern. The thing is, to play Collected Company in your deck, you need close to 30 creatures with converted mana cost 3 or less, mana value 3 or less. The same is going to be true of Assemble the Players. If you're playing this card in your deck, you're going to need pretty close, I think, to 30 creatures with power 2 or less in your deck, or else it's not going to be worth it. If you do have that many creatures with power 2 or less, Assemble the Players is going to be an absurdly powerful card advantage engine in your deck. So for example, in Standard right now, we have Mono White Toxic, this white aggro deck. The thing is, it only plays like 12 or 13 creatures usually. In that deck, Assemble the Players, even though all the creatures are small enough to make it work, is just not going to be consistent enough, right? If you think about it, you got 12 creatures, let's say. Let's round up to 15 creatures. That is 1/4 of your deck. That means Assemble the Players is going to be casting you a card roughly 1 every 4 turns. Totally not worth the cost. On the other hand, we have decks like Humans, where you're playing like 30 creatures, and I think all of them, are very close to all of them, and have power 2 or less. In a deck like that, Assemble the Players is either a really good main deck card advantage engine, or worst case, a sideboard card that you bring in those grindy matchups to help you fight through removal and sweepers and sunfalls and so forth. The question for Standard is going to be, does it beat out Takacia's Welcome? That's kind of like the default right now. The cards are not exactly the same, but they're kind of similar. They want you to play a bunch of cheap creatures. Takacia's Welcome has some upsides where it works with like Mirix and token producers that Assemble the Players does not. But I think one of the cool things about this, and I don't know if you can fit them both in the same deck, but they work pretty well together, right? If you got down Takacia's Welcome, and then you like cast a creature from the top of Assemble the Players, that's probably going to trigger Takacia's Welcome to draw you an extra card and create a ton of card advantage in your weenie deck. Also worth mentioning, this is really good with Disguise. It does work, as far as I understand, with Disguise. So let's say you have Aurelia's Vindicator on the top of your deck. You obviously can't just cast it because its power is 4, but if you cast it face down, disguised as a 2/2 creature, then its power's low enough that it actually works with Assemble the Player. So Disguise and Morph, if you don't want to play Willbender off the top of your deck, I guess you could do it either way, but you can Morph and Disguise off of this card. I think as far as tricks to actually powering this card up, the easiest one's probably just being able to change the top card of your library. A fetch land, a Field of Ruin, a Cabretti Courtyard, whatever. If you have an extra land on top, too expensive of a creature, a spell on top, being able to shuffle your deck and get a new look at a card to play for free, that's really, really powerful. The other trick to this card is it works really well with Flash. So the restriction is once each turn, not once on each of your turns, which means if you're playing Constructed, you can cast a spell during your turn, another one during your opponent's turn. If you're playing Commander, you can theoretically be casting 4 spells off the top of the deck each turn cycle, because you cast Fairy Mastermind during your turn, Spectral Adversary during your opponent's, Deep Known Terramancer during the next opponent's, a Spell Queller during the next opponent's, and that's a lot of value for 2 mana. So I think the best home for this card in really any like Richard style weenie deck is probably going to be able to take advantage of this in Commander. The first thing I thought of, though, is this is like the perfect Afara card, because Afara usually wants a bunch of cheap creatures, and it wants you to play them on each of your turn, because Afara triggers as long as you had a creature enter the battlefield during that turn, so it really encourages you to play those flash threats, so you can play each turn and be able to trigger it multiple times each turn cycle. Assemble the Players is very, very similar in what it asks for, so it seems like an Afara staple, but really, I mean, I'll ask Richard about it on the next podcast, but I assume this is a card that he's going to jam in a lot of his decks, because he's just always playing the Spirit of Companions and all these small creatures to grind out value, and this seems like a really nice engine there. So Assemble the Players, a narrow card in the sense that many decks are not going to be constructed in a way to take advantage of it, but an incredibly powerful card for decks that do meet its requirement of playing a ton of creatures with power 2 or less. In those decks, I think this could be a legit constructed staple and a really good commander card. Finally today, couple of low rarity cards real quick. The only one that's actually intriguing for constructed maybe is Buried in the Garden. So Buried in the Garden, 4-mana Selesnya Aura. It enchants a land. When it ETBs, you get to exile target non-land permanent you don't control until it leaves the battlefield, and then when the enchanted land is tapped for a mana, its controller adds an additional mana of any color. So this is essentially like Ossification, but kinda better because it hits any non-land permanent, not just creatures and planeswalkers. Stapled together with a Fertile Ground, 4 mana is kind of a lot for this effect, but I like that it's removal that also ramps you. So if you're trying to ramp into Atraxa, let's say, or a Tally, these huge top-end threats, this could be a pretty good option. It comes down, deals with your opponent's best thing, even if it is maybe temporary, and ramps you into your big finish. So I think this could have relevance in those big, like, 4 or 5 color ramp style decks, is a fixing removal spell that also ramps you into your finisher. Otherwise, a couple of random draft chaff uncommons. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers for today. So let me know what you think. This set is looking sweeter and sweeter, I think, by the day. But what's your favorite card of the day? What are you hyped for? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Murders at Karlov Manor spoilers. So until then, everyone, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the video where we looked at the best spell from every single year of Magic the Gathering.